with that said, kind of diving into the DBQ, first of all, I put the slide up there. I absolutely love teaching the DBQ. We're going to talk about when I teach it, but it's a blast. I tell my kids, I joke around when I teach the DBQ that I can be rented out at birthday parties. I'll have a station in the corner. People have like balloon making, and I'll be the person in the corner doing DBQs. I absolutely love them. I think they're fun. I think they're in a way like a murder mystery. And so teaching it and the kids being able to see it in that way, I think it makes it a little bit fun. And hopefully you guys will understand a little bit about what we mean when we're teaching it. So real quickly, it is worth the discussion to kind of bring this up. What is your order of operation when teaching the DBQ? And what's your rationale for putting it there? So really quickly, I'll share for maybe about a minute. When teaching the DBQ, when teaching in AP World History, the question is like, where and when do we want to start teaching the DBQ? And I'm going to make an argument that I teach it last. There's some years that I taught it on the beginning of the year. I've moved that back into maybe 2 months in. And actually where I teach in my career is I actually do not teach the DBQ until the second semester. And that might seem a little late, but I love it. I would fit it there, and I'm going to tell you why. Looking at scores, obviously when we get everything back from the College Board, DBQ is our strongest area. So we teach it. I teach it. The last of the major focuses on the test, but it's the strongest part of our testing when we look at our data. So I start with a multiple choice. I believe in that, starting with the multiple choice. I think it teaches and you learn how to read a document, even reading a textbook, practice note-taking, learning to analyze documents. So you're going to be starting with all those skills. And the easiest thing to test on that is multiple choice, which works into the stimulus-based questions. And that's all about practice, exposing them to practice, reading those documents, working on that skill. We then move into the LEQs, and that would be the next thing that we teach in the course as the year progresses. And I think I put it there because I really like introducing them to writing formal essays before I do the SAQs. And so kids learn how to answer a prompt. They learn how to develop a thesis, what a thesis is, what are the thesis blessings. We'll talk about that a little bit later, and how to make a thesis with a roadmap or categories of investigation. I then translate into SAQs where the kids learn to use history to answer questions. And I finally then start diving into the DBQs. So that's where I fit it. But I would ask you guys that question is, where do you put the DBQ? Why do you put it there? But I will tell you that the DBQ, once you start teaching it, it enhances every other aspect of the class. So if you've taught the other things first, the DBQ makes the kids that much better in those areas. So that's kind of where I would kind of make a pitch for teaching it. A quick glance at the schedule. In one of my previous webinars, we talked about how Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of every week are my skill days. So this was just a snippet of my calendar. We had a unit exam test from 1750 to 1900 on a Friday, but you can see that like that first week in February, the first 3 days we spent in class practicing DBQ skills. Again, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday are my skill days, and the DBQ offers so many great little areas that you can dive into and explore. We're going to talk about how to develop categories of investigation, lesson plans called like 3 doc thesis statements, and then playing around with the HAP skill. Those are like 1 or 2 days in entirety, just exposing them like it's bell ringers to a document, and then trying to explore, that analytical skill of, what's the historical situation, what's the audience, what's the purpose, what's the point of view. So I just kind of wanted to raise this up because I think it's important of where you place the DBQ and then how you construct your class. And again, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday are my skill days. Thursdays are my information days, and Fridays are my assessment days. So this was just a glance of something that I did a couple weeks ago. Okay. Now, getting into the DBQ a little bit more specifically. When we look at the DBQ, I think one of the things in my mantra is when teaching the DBQ, obviously it's worth 7 points. And I will always tell the kids to get 3 before 7. But before we can get 3, we got to get 1. And the most important skill that you need to work on in your classroom is that thesis, getting that thesis point, and spending time on working on getting that thesis point. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of prep. I think the next two easiest points to be had is the evidence point. So if you're working on the thesis point and you get the thesis point, it's natural to be able to get that evidence point. And that'll come when we talk about it. And I know this crowd, it could be a mix of inexperienced or experienced teachers, first-year teachers, 20 years teachers. But that thesis point is really, really, really important. Spending and giving the kids time to break down documents, formulating and extracting information out of it, and being able to then, use the documents as evidence. I think those are the three that you really need to shoot for. And so we in my class, right, I definitely teach getting the 3 before the 7. I want the kids to be able to get those 3 points, and then we can work on the extras. And I think the extras, as I put on there, is contextualization, which Charlie's going to spend a lot of time on today. The outside evidence point is something that they can probably get. And then analysis, which is the HAP point, and then finally the complexity point. So we're going to talk about these, being a grader, seeing where kids got points, that thesis point. Once they got that thesis point, that's the light switch, right? That's the light switch for the grader that gives the essay purpose. And then using the evidence are those next points that, strengthen that thesis, and then those points follow. So kind of diving into that a little bit is getting that thesis point. We spend a lot of time, this goes back in the first semester of a class, but spending time on learning how to analyze a prompt. And I think that's often overstated. I teach in my program here. I'm in Carl Sandburg High School in Orland Park, Illinois. We've built the program to include 265 freshmen. So currently right now we are teaching 265 freshmen, 9 sections of AP World History, about 30 in each section. But we actually spend time on learning how to analyze a prompt. So that's a really important skill. So when the kids get a question, breaking down that prompt and being able for them to put that prompt in their own words, and really interpreting the question. Because being an AP, being an AP grader, one of the things that I saw on the essays, and Charlie can talk more about this being a table leader, is that kids just don't answer the question. And so that's something that's really important. Getting the kids to understand, it seems basic, but interpreting that question is really important. We use exit slips, and just that basic skill of what exactly is the task of this question. So it's got to start there. So really quickly, as you move on for that, I am a huge believer in categorical thesis statements. So categorical thesis statements, I think, is the way to go, especially with the DBQ. Learn to develop categories of investigation that answer the question. Charlie taught me one time when reading thesis statements, right? When working on thesis statements and working on categories of investigation, there's pebbles, there's rocks, and boulders, and you want to shoot for rocks. They're the Goldilocks. They're right in between. They're not too specific. They're not too vague. Rocks are the categories that you want explained enough, right, that you can open up later in body paragraphs, but it's not vague enough that somebody doesn't know what they're talking about. It's not too specific for a thesis. So we really practice this, but I would, and I'm going to make a pitch and show you how to do it, but developing and moving towards that categorical thesis. This is something that I'm sure the AP World community knows, and probably AP Euro, AP US history, but those the 3 thesis blessings. Tell your kids these are analytical words and great ways to start essays, thesis statements. Although, while, or despite, pick one. They're just analytical words. I mean, I'll have a student and I'll just say, all right, here's the word, although. All right, finish the sentence. And the kid has to process, and the kid has to realize, and he has to connect 2 things. And it's just, they're doing analysis, and those words invite analysis. And that's what AP is all about. They want to see that you can think. When writing a thesis, just one tip real quick is that the essays have moved towards evaluate the extent to which. So when writing a thesis statement, we want to make sure that we are evaluating the extent, right? It might be as simple as saying something's greater than the other. But, keep that in mind when teaching it. All right. So when we get to the DBQ, when we're talking about the thesis statements, one of the things is, I told you about the categorical thesis. And one of the things that I think is super fun is having the kids categorize. I have a daughter in kindergarten, and she's got the bugs that she can separate. In class, they work on that a lot, being able to label, categorize, bucket information. And that is, I think, a really important skill in the DBQ. And before the changes were made for the DBQ, they actually gave when it was a 9-point scale, they actually gave a point for being able to categorize.